back, LTCC community. I'm doing another workshop here on issues connected to moving our workspaces and also our learning environments to the DE format of Canvas and Zoom. So this came up actually because quite a few of you have been pinging me with messages about things you've been reading, concerns in the news about privacy. If you look anywhere, there are blog posts about people dealing with unfortunate situations that sometimes do happen in the new virtual environments that we're inhabiting. An example of that is what's called Zoombombing here, where people come in and try to take over a meeting and post inappropriate, offensive comments or pornographic or violent imagery. So in the meeting today, we'll talk about how we're adapting to these new work environments and learning environments, and we need to be aware of some of the issues that are out there. We often call what we're working in now telepresence, and telepresence is a form of presence that happens at a distance. And actually, as I've noted in some of the meetings we've had, including hiring committee meetings, in some ways it's actually better to have some of these meetings because you can get a more intimate feel of a conversation. You really do have to be present because your face is on a screen. You can't necessarily be looking at your phone or something like this. So in a sense, the attention span of people, I think, may improve just because of using this more intimate form of communication of what we call telepresence. The same thing can be true, I think, in classroom environments where maybe students will be more engaged because there's a pressure for them to really show that they're paying attention. We've all taught in large classrooms with 100 or 200 students where you can't always be sure if students are paying attention. Now, that being said, for all the positive things that we can associate with telepresence, we also realize there could be very negative situations and contexts that are brought into these new worlds that we're dealing with now. And that's really the focus of this workshop webinar today. These are just some cases in the news. Again, a Zoom bombing is not unlike a photo bomb. So if you're doing a Zoom session and people log on, perhaps people who've hacked onto your site, which actually, as I'll talk about, is somewhat hard to do, but it could even be in a large classroom. If someone is teaching at a UC where you have 100 students in a class and you're allowing for full video participation, chat opportunities for students to comment, even screen sharing, then you really do open yourselves up to situations where someone could post very negative content that could affect you and your students, of course. If we look at these other articles, they all have the same flair: how to secure your online experience and prevent uninvited guests. And I should say in this workshop today, we should realize that if you are working, say, like Lisa or Kelsey in the president's office trying to set up public board meetings for a board of trustees, that's one context of access. And I think in those cases, you want to limit access as allowed under the law, under the Brown Act. There still is always an opportunity for public participation. But that public participation is not defined as full video or options to screen share or to use a virtual background. So in the case of doing a large public meeting, a webinar format, using the waiting room, not allowing some of the functionality for participants that could be available in full-fledged video chats would be appropriate. In a classroom environment, it's a little bit different. If we do too much to limit the participation of our students, we're throwing out the whole issue, the advantage really of telepresence, and that's the interactivity among participants in an environment like a DE learning environment. Again, USC and other school districts really trying to react to this situation. This just came up in the LA Times yesterday. So a lot of concerns about this. So as we talk about issues today, I've divided these into three main categories. So the first would be the Zoom bombing, any invasion of your space with racist, pornographic, or inappropriate content, including through Zoom's virtual backdrop or background or screen sharing, or even for that matter, file uploads through the chat feature in Zoom. And I'm saying right now, this is why you really do need to be on top of it in terms of understanding what the functionality within Zoom, what those functions are, and then the same thing for Canvas. If you're not aware that something might be shared during one of your virtual conversations or sessions with your class or your meeting group, then you could put yourself at danger. You could expose you and your participants to issues in terms of harassment. So very important for us to know the functionality of all the technology that we're working with. And then, unfortunately, as we often have to do, on the back end with our settings and some other features that we can talk about today, set yourself up for safety, and we'll talk about how to do that. With privacy issues, we know FERPA, the law that relates to not sharing student information passed in the 1970s, is very important to protect and uphold today. So we'll talk about how not to share things publicly that might violate FERPA in terms of your student rights for confidentiality and privacy. Secondly, though, there are issues related to academic freedom and faculty privacy, and I just found this article today that a few of you sent to me from the Chronicle of Higher Ed. And what if you recorded a video, or a student recorded a video, and then that became the subject of online information and perhaps potential harassment? So we want to protect our faculty and staff as well in these times. And then third, a little lighter context but still appropriate to talk about, that would be inappropriate learning or work environments. In other words, what rules are you establishing for your meeting participants or your students? Do you allow children, pets, dogs, or other potential distractions to play a part in any live Zoom synchronous video sessions? Keep in mind we have rules, and if you ever want information, reach out to me or the President's Office, Student Services. We could get you up to speed on some of the rules in terms of campus physical environments. One of those, for example, doesn't allow children, say in a classroom setting, because of the issue of legal liability. Well, we haven't really defined some of those for virtual spaces, so it may be important for us to think about these issues moving forward as we're moving from the physical classroom and physical meeting space to the virtual classroom and virtual meeting space. So let's begin with the topic of Zoom bombing. Again, just like photo bombing, someone takes over your Zoom session. They upload inappropriate content. They share a pornographic or racist image. And it happened at one of these meetings where I think probably the organizers didn't have enough pre-settings set up so as to protect themselves from this kind of situation. One possibility here is that if you use the Zoom virtual background, of course, most of us would say that would be used by most of our students and participants in an appropriate manner, of course. But if you go to your settings, you see that one of the many options is you could use a virtual background. And so, if that's the case, you just want to think about how is that going to impact your classroom? How is that going to impact your meeting space? What I think comes up in this topic sometimes, and this also relates to appropriate work environments, is if the space behind you, like this space here, is fairly neutral, or if there are a few things in the space, you could quite immediately use one of these virtual backdrops. They're kind of like green screen, but they're not perfect. When you move quickly, just the algorithm, it has issues getting caught up, and so they're not actually the best technology, but for what it is and the purpose of it, which is to remove any clutter from your space behind you, it actually serves that purpose. And this could be an example if you didn't have the appropriate meeting space and you're in the living room and children and dogs and other things, TV sets are going, you could put this on, and as long as you're muted, it really does protect the professionalism of the workspace, I guess I would say. Now, that being said, anyone at any point then could upload a video or image backdrop that would be inappropriate. And so you do want to think about that in terms of making sure that students are uploading, or meeting participants, appropriate images if they're using that feature. And we can also talk about that later in terms of maybe some of your student codes of conduct that might have to be rewritten for this telepresence working environment. And teaching environment. So again, just think about whether you want to use that feature, allow it, and how that might impact your learning or work environment. A second context here to think about is if you allowed participants the opportunity in a meeting to share their own desktop, to annotate, to of course participate in group chat, and do any of the other functionality available in a lot of Zoom meetings, that could also disrupt your meeting. I have been doing quite a few of these workshops, and occasionally some person will, by mistake, start drawing on the screen. And it just gets a little distracting. But you just want to be aware of, if you had a public meeting and you had people out there who are virtual scoundrels, and there are many virtual scoundrels out there. Some of them public and some of them less public. But those individuals, of course, could get a kick out of trying to take over your meeting, to write inappropriate things using the annotation tool, to share a desktop that has rude, offensive, racist, sexist, pornographic images. So to prevent some of that, what we could really do ahead of time, and we'll talk about solutions here in a second, is either set up restrictions on what participants could share. This will be done sometimes through your meetings, but primarily through your tab on, let me just go to my Zoom here. This is done primarily through your settings tab. So you can certainly consult my workshops on Zoom, but in some cases on meetings, you can actually control, if you schedule a new meeting, you can control whether you want participants' video on or off. You can also pre-mute, and you can do the waiting room and authenticated users. And authenticated users is a way where you could try to be sure that you're not going to get any people participating in a meeting or certainly a class environment who might be trying to hijack it for their purposes. So some of it is done within schedule a meeting. Quite a bit more, though, is done in settings. Again, settings very full featured. This is where you could go in and set up all your preferences prior to any meeting, and then this will populate and override any of the more specific settings in meetings, which you could, of course, change, and you could come back and change this at any time. So this is one opportunity, particularly if you have a password for joining meetings. That could also be very beneficial. Even though you could post your personal meeting invite, which is very unique to your account, found under your account, you could then personally assign at the last minute a password. And then that password then could be sent out through a text message or another format. Without that password, you can't join even that instant meeting. So think about that too, because over time, your personal found under your profile, if you're wondering what this personal information here. And of course, the minute I put this on YouTube, right? I mean, in a sense, that could be exposure as well to someone taking advantage of that. So there are some options there under settings to really think about, because if you allow for full access of every participant in every setting, and it's not to say that a student will be sharing racist or pornographic imagery. I think we have controls in place in terms of our student conduct, which we can talk about as well. But it's more just accidents and distractions that can really take away from the professionalism of your work meeting on Zoom or your student class conversations and meeting. So some solutions then, do consider keeping your meeting invite private such that that's not going out all over the internet. That's one way of controlling access. Control permissions, as I said, under either these options in Zoom, or when you start a meeting, use your toolbar, use your video participant tabs that appear in these parts of the screen to control people, to mute people. You can remove people. You have a lot of controls as a host, as I mentioned here, so take advantage of those. You can also use a waiting room if you like. That's one way for making sure that the folks who are going to access are the people you want. It's not always certain. There are certainly fake avatars in the world of Twitter and so forth where people try to impersonate celebrities, and you think, oh, that's the celebrity tweeting, and it's not. And hence you get people saying the real whatever person's name that is. Generally, I would say with Zoom, you have the ability to require people to sign up for an account, like your students or staff members, anyone working on in a meeting context. And then if you used a waiting room and you didn't recognize that person, you could then contact and say, hey, you're going to have to indicate who you are before I let you in. So you do have some controls at the level of being a host using a lot of these features. And then again, you can use a webinar. I know the Board of Trustees, the all-campus meeting was a webinar. Sometimes that's not because of Zoom bombing. It's for the sake of practicality. Trying to control everyone's microphone if you have 200 participants can be really crazy and challenging. That being said, realize this point here that I've summarized in this continuum, this chart here. So on the one end, you have interactivity and democratic communication. And Zoom and many of the other technologies we're using now are absolutely amazing in terms of creating new forms of telepresence and virtual community, and indeed democratic communication. I'm a big proponent of virtual spaces, of virtual immersive spaces, of video games used for even therapeutic purposes that I've studied in my own work and research. That being said, we realize that full democratic communication comes with a disadvantage, and that's on this end of the continuum of safety and security, trying to protect people from harassment, from inappropriate comments. We have legal obligations in a lot of our areas of work where we can't just expose people to the kind of hate and vitriol that often is a part, unfortunately, of social media. So we have to police content and behavior, but that comes at the price of interactivity and democratic communication. So in a sense, it's not unlike how the security services and the airline industry after 9/11 adapted to terrorism, with the realization that in a free society, because of access, even though you're going to have a lot of good things that come along with access and democratic communication, you also have negative things that come along with it because people try to abuse the system. And even before coronavirus and all the telepresence that we've experienced now and will continue to experience for many months in the future for sure, we are aware of hacking and other issues that can always come up. Denial of service attacks. Our own website has been hacked over the years. I've been in conversations recently where I've heard Al Frangioni and others talking about the need to make things easy in terms of our technology, but to also then not expose ourselves to hackers and people who might want to hijack a Zoom meeting and so forth. So keep this in mind as a mental picture and figure out how to address that in your own context, whether you're leading a meeting on campus like a board meeting or you're teaching a class with your students, perhaps using Zoom. Actually, a very interesting philosophical discussion to just think about in general there. And here is one more. I will share with you at the end a series of resources on my teaching website. This one's quite good. This is from Zoom, from their blog. And this is just detailing how to keep party crashers from crashing your Zoom event. I mentioned some general options for you to manage, say, screen sharing and your privacy settings. This is really the place to go to. So look at this page if you're interested in how to do this. It talks about managing screen sharing, managing participants, all these options for muting, two-factor authentication, turning off annotation, no private chat, disabling video, and then trying the waiting room. So this is, I think, really good. If you get a chance, check this out, and I'll share the resource link with you here at the end of this video. Some great options there for you to check out. Now, the second main area there, moving beyond Zoom bombing, is privacy issues. We all know certainly that FERPA is very important to protect the confidentiality of student records. Many people in student services can, of course, talk about how significant this is and how much of their daily lives and work requirements focus on this very issue. Teachers have a responsibility as well, of course. So there are two types of privacy issues here. One would be related to students. The second one would be related to faculty members and maybe some of their content and lecture content videos being shared without their knowledge. So I wanted to show you this here. And this is that article that says, a negative side of remote teaching could be that videos could be weaponized. And very specific, they're talking about a conservative political action group who told college students who were being asked to switch to online classes to share with Turning Point videos of blatant indoctrination. Some of you are maybe aware of a former political science instructor here at LTCC who was subject of forms of harassment related to a public lecture he gave in the Bay Area, which was shared, and it became the subject of attacks by conservative groups. Eventually this became part of a NPR story and the national news. And it's certainly terrible that this happens. It's terrible certainly that professors have to deal with this kind of harassment. So in the case I described with the political science faculty member, someone recorded a video at a public discussion, at a public lecture. Because it's possible to see that videos could be recorded, it could definitely be an issue. Now, of course, you can control that. Generally, as a host, you decide if you can record it or not, and it's not the case that participants will be allowed to record. That being said, keep this in mind. At any point, I could, put a video camera on the screen. I could put an audio recorder from my phone. I could easily, without you knowing, record what you're doing in your online class. I could also do that through various technologies of like the one I'm using right now to capture this video that I'm shooting here using the wonderful tool of Canvas Studio. So that is important to remember, even though you control recording on your end in terms of Zoom features, students could certainly record anything that you lecture in a Zoom environment. This could also be a concern in terms of students who are perhaps sharing information, say in a counseling class or something where there's a privacy expectation, and then other students might, without anyone knowing, record those conversations. And so I think it's very important to keep this in mind and protect yourself as a faculty member, as a staff member, however that might come up. So going back to FERPA for students, you can of course read the FERPA Act in its entirety online, but it's very important to think about how we can protect student rights in terms of any of the information we're sharing about them online. And I wanted to show you a really good guide here. This is also on the resources, which I'll offer to you at the end. So how you can find more of this on your own. This is a whole Zoom conversation about FERPA and FERPA applying to students. And it doesn't say a lot about our guidelines, but it talks about how, obviously, in the era of post-Cambridge Analytica and what happened with that whole sharing without people's knowledge of a harmless poll on Facebook that impacted, say, the move to Brexit, the election of Donald Trump, and so forth, if you've watched the documentaries on this. A lot of concern about privacy in general. So this describes just how Zoom controls some of that. On our own, we should certainly have some conversations about how to protect student privacy in our classes. One possibility here is to use Canvas as a closed space to control access and privacy. Anytime you log onto your Canvas class, log onto your course, whatever course that is a closed learning space. Even if you shared something to Canvas Commons, that will never share student records with the outside world. It will never share contact information of students, etc. So Canvas obviously is your closed space to protect privacy. And I would say to you that if you're thinking about non-Canvas apps, if you're thinking about video recording devices or apps rather that maybe include FaceTime, to really think about, will that protect the privacy of your students? Think about that ahead of time before you use those features, because we don't want something, say, if you did a YouTube live session and your students were visible and then that was shared to the internet or to YouTube as a public video, and you could do it as a private, of course, and talk to me offline about YouTube applications of this. But that scenario there would absolutely be a concern of violation of FERPA. So my solution there is to say, do not post video or student content to external sites like YouTube without redactions of student information. I recently have done a series of videos, and I have a filter you can see here on my video program called Final Cut Pro that allows me to redact certain areas, to pixelate areas of the screen that have any personal student information, so make it completely invisible to the outside world. Very important to do that. If you ever do post anything externally, you wouldn't want to have anything audio or visual content of students being shared with the outside world. Do notify students of any privacy matters up front. So if you're using Zoom's functionality of an attendance report as a way to take attendance, just tell them that's how you're doing it. Now, that being said, using Zoom to take attendance does not imply at all any violation of confidentiality, so long as you don't post your student roster online. All of our student records are kept private, and the folks at Student Services and the One Stop are dealing with this on a daily basis, as are many other people on campus. Financial aid, I know, has had conversations about how to maintain student confidentiality in this era in which we're moving to more online work and application situations. So I think that's very important. Let students know about privacy matters. I was talking with someone who's teaching a group counseling class coming up, and I was saying, hey, there's a private chat feature in the Zoom chat function that could be very useful for you. You could actually let students know that if you think you're going to say something that could be not harmful, but potentially upsetting, given the dynamic and sometimes upsetting context that happen in, say, counseling settings or addiction study settings or social science settings, use the private chat in Zoom just to be sure that students are okay with anything that's being said, particularly in the context of triggering statements or anything that might trigger an emotional or negative reaction in terms of a student who suffered a past abuse or situation that could be triggered by something upsetting being shared in a context of virtual environments like the Zoom environments that we're working with now. So definitely think about all these issues. There are some, I think, easy solutions. This is one that's easier to handle, I would say, overall than Zoom, which is the Zoom bombing issue, which is a more dynamic environment. Now, the third of these, I think, is maybe, I wouldn't say the most fun, but the easiest to address, and it's probably the least serious. So consider inappropriate learning or work environments. What are your specific requirements for your class or meeting participants in terms of the nature of the space? What should it look like? Can it include children, pets, or other distractions? And many of you probably remember, very humorous before coronavirus, live BBC News interview with a Korean expert, a policy expert, and during it, his wife and two children video bombed or interview bombed the meeting, the interview, and it was actually really funny, and it made all the social media channels. I think millions of people watch this video. Very humorous context. So that's kind of fun, when that kind of stuff happens. And we're not really talking about a situation like this where there's an accident or, you're in a virtual classroom and a student has an accident or something, they spill their coffee and, something funny like this. We're talking more about situations where the environment is not appropriate for work or learning, or it's potentially distracting. So if I was, teaching a class right now, what I would say is, I would like you to think about having a professional work environment or learning environment if we're doing live video. I'm not suggesting you have to have a green screen or you have to dress up in a suit or a dress, but I am suggesting, for example, and this is a sample, I do not want pets or children to appear in the learning environment. And this is an example of something we've defined locally in physical context at the college to protect ourselves from liability. So if you were teaching a class and you allowed a student to bring in children or a pet, and there wasn't a liability set up for that situation, the pet bites someone or the child, is injured, there are clear legal liability issues there. We haven't really detailed this at the level that I'm aware of at the moment of recording this video in terms of the virtual learning environment. I think it would be totally appropriate for you, for your work context, for your meetings, also for your classroom context, to define what you want to take place. If you're fine with children and pets, and I don't think there would be a legal liability if someone was harmed or had an accident while they're participating in the virtual class, I should never say never, right? It's a very interesting environment in terms of the legal world. But I would think as long as that's okay, you could define it one way or the other. I personally would recommend not having a lot of that. It's cute to see children and pets on Zoom. It's cute to see them in physical learning spaces or meeting spaces. But just sometimes the movement on a screen, I try to be very aware of this. Like even if if I'm getting a drink of water or something like that during a virtual meeting, it's fine. But I try not to get up, say if I have to get a printout from my printer and leave my computer monitor, because just the movement that we detect with our eyes when that happens is a slight and subtle distraction for that moment. So what I recommend is muting yourself with your video, and you could recommend this to your students as well. And then when you're done and you're back and in full attention mode, if you will, in front of your screen, then unmute your video. Again, you also need to define requirements for participation in your class, video on, video off, that kind of thing. And that's why I recommend this last point here. Really do consider a first day of class workshop on the topic. And discuss, what are appropriate instances of allowing these situations. What would you like their environment to look like when they're participating fully in your virtual online class through Zoom? Again, be aware, know what the challenges are, and one way of being aware is, learning the technology, learning what's available in Canvas, learning what's available in Zoom, thinking about the potential hurdles or issues that could be on the horizon in terms of Zoom bombing, privacy violations of students and faculty, and of course the issue of appropriate and inappropriate environments for virtual distance learning and virtual distance meetings in terms of using Zoom in a synchronous manner. So be aware of those issues and then choose the options in terms of controlling those issues that work the best for you, your students, and your co-workers. I do encourage you, go to my website, ltccteachingandlearning.com. When you get there, you can click on the COVID-19 tab, and once you get there, it will actually then allow you to see all the various resources that have been set up for you, including upcoming trainings. But most important to this workshop, go to the section near the bottom after media called Privacy and Virtual Community, Canvas and Zoom. And all the articles I've referenced in my video workshop today are available for your reading here just by clicking on them. So take a look at those and adapt them as needed for your learning or work environment. So as always, thanks for listening. As ideas and situations and contexts occur to you, send me an email, send me a text message. Indeed, the workshop today was a result of a few of you out there texting me and emailing me about some concerns you had related to a number of the issues in today's workshop. So good luck, keep going, enjoy the virtuality, enjoy the telepresence that's presented here by using some of these new technologies that are certainly transforming the way we think about our work and our teaching and learning here at Lake Tahoe Community College.